Welcome, friends. In this episode, we will hear the story of the human trafficker Lucas and the alien queen Elena. Get ready to listen to this amazing science fiction story. Enjoy watching. I accidentally bumped into the alien queen's hip. She turned around angrily, but when she saw me, she smiled. The floating bazaar of Sethari was, in Lucas's professional opinion, less a marketplace and more a controlled catastrophe that happened to sell things. It drifted 3 kilometers above a gas giant nobody had bothered to name, a lattice of hovering platforms strung together by gravity bridges and stubbornness, and beneath a canopy of 10,000 lanterns that floated wherever they pleased. 1,000 different species pressed shoulder to shoulder, elbow to thorax, tentacle to whatever Lucas happened to be standing on. The air smelled of frying dough, ozone, 6 kinds of incense, and something a vendor 2 stalls down insisted was perfume, but Lucas privately classified as a war crime. He was doing what he did best, which was talking too much while selling too little. Genuine Earth artifacts, he announced to a passing cluster of shoppers, holding up a harmonica as though it were a holy relic. Handcrafted, musical, guaranteed to produce sound, possibly the correct sound. The cluster, 3 individuals sharing what appeared to be one very tall coat, regarded the harmonica with the polite bafflement Lucas had come to know as his most loyal customer base. Humans were a novelty out here, a young species that had wandered into the galactic neighborhood roughly 40 years ago and immediately started selling its junk to anyone who'd hold still. The galaxy found humans charming the way one finds a small dog charming, endearing, faintly ridiculous, best not left near anything expensive. "It makes music," Lucas repeated and demonstrated. The note that emerged was less music and more the sound of a machine dying with dignity. The tall coat departed at speed. "You know," said the drone hovering at his shoulder, a battered little translator unit named Pip, whom Lucas had won in a card game and regretted ever since. "On most planets, that noise is used to disperse crowds. That's called ambiance, Pip. That's called a health violation." Lucas pocketed the harmonica and surveyed his stall, which consisted of a folding table, a tarp, and the accumulated debris of a homeworld that had never asked to be represented by any of it. Freeze-dried coffee, a stack of pocket watches he'd described to customers as antique, a word doing an Olympic amount of heavy lifting, a jar of buttons. Somewhere in the galaxy, he was certain, a human ancestor was watching this and quietly weeping. Business, in a word, was terrible. In 2 words, it was aggressively terrible. He had docking fees due, a ship that made concerning noises whenever he asked it to do ship things, and roughly enough credits to buy either dinner or dignity, but not both. "I'm going to make a lap," he told Pip, tucking the takings pouch into his coat. "See if anyone's buying. You watch the stall." With what eyes? Emotionally watch the stall. He plunged into the crowd, which received him the way a river receives a dropped coin. Sethari on a market day was a full contact experience. Lucas had learned to move through it by reading currents, the sway of the throng, the gaps that opened and closed, the small courtesies of a place where stepping on the wrong appendage could start a blood feud that outlived your grandchildren. He was good at this, actually. It was the one genuinely useful skill his years of scraping by had given him, the ability to slip through a packed room without touching a soul, which made what happened next so deeply, cosmically unfair. Later, Lucas would reconstruct it and find no one to blame but the universe's sense of comedy. A lantern dipped low, someone shouted about spoiling fruit, the current lurched, a merchant hauling a floating crate cut across his path, and Lucas, sidestepping the crate with the grace of a man who has done this 1,000 times, put his shoulder squarely, firmly, unmistakably into the hip of the person beside him. The entire market inhaled. It was the strangest thing. One moment there was the ordinary roar of 10,000 voices, and the next a silence spread outward from the point of contact like a ripple in reverse, stall by stall, until even the lanterns seemed to hold still. Lucas felt the quiet on the back of his neck before he understood it. Slowly, with the terrible clarity of a man who suspects he has stepped in something and is afraid to look down, he turned. She was tall, taller than him, and draped in ceremonial silver that caught the lantern light and threw it back doubled. Her skin was a deep, luminous blue, the blue of deep water at the edge of night, and rising from beneath her circlet were two long, elegantly pointed ears that would have looked at home on some woodland creature from Earth's oldest stories. She was, without exaggeration, the most striking person Lucas had ever seen, and she was turning toward him with an expression that promised his day was about to get significantly worse. Around her, 6 figures in matching silver stepped forward as one, and 6 hands settled on the hilts of 6 very serious-looking blades. "Oh," said Lucas, to no one. "That's a lot of swords." Pip's voice crackled faintly in his earpiece from across the market. "What did you do?" "I don't. I bumped into. It was an accident." The woman's eyes fixed on him, and they were the color of sapphires with the lights on, and they were furious. Somewhere behind Lucas, a vendor had begun quietly packing up his entire stall, which struck Lucas as an excellent instinct he lacked the legs to follow. He couldn't move. He'd faced down customs officers, loan sharks, and one memorable spider thing that collected debts on commission, and he had never once felt the specific spinal terror of being looked at the way this woman was looking at him now. "Your Radiance," murmured one of the guards, in a tone that suggested Lucas's continued existence was a formality about to be corrected. And Lucas, who had no idea he was standing in front of Elena, Azure Queen of the Drifting Court, whose displeasure could empty a marketplace faster than a fire and a rumor of free samples combined, did the only thing his panicking body would allow. He stood there, wide-eyed, mouth slightly open, radiating the pure and helpless bewilderment of a man who has wandered into a legend by mistake. The Queen's gaze swept his face, the honest panic, the cheap coat, the total absence of any idea whom he had just touched. And the anger went out of her like a tide. Her sapphire eyes softened. The furious line of her mouth eased, curved, and slowly, curiously, as though even she were surprised by it. The Azure Queen smiled. The guards froze. Whatever they had braced for, it was not this. Their hands hovered, uncertain, and they traded glances over her shoulder like men who had walked into the wrong ceremony. In all their years of service, not one of them had seen that look on her face, and not one of them could have told you what it meant. Least of all Lucas, whose heart, for reasons he could not begin to explain, had started pounding like a fist against a locked door. There is a particular quality to being escorted somewhere against your will by people who are unfailingly polite about it. Nobody touched Lucas. Nobody so much as raised a voice. The 6 guards simply arranged themselves around him in a formation that was, technically, an honor guard, and functionally, a cage with excellent posture, and the crowd melted out of their path, and Lucas found himself walking whether he'd intended to or not, borne along on a current of silver and silence toward the far edge of the bazaar, where the private docks hung. "I'd like to state for the record," Lucas murmured, "that I have money. Not a lot, but some. If this is about the docking fees—" "It is not about the docking fees," said the Queen without turning her head. "Great. Wonderful. So it's about the hip thing. The bump, which, I cannot stress enough, was an accident, and if there's a form I can fill out, or a fine, or a small tasteful public flogging, do humans always talk this much when they are frightened? Only the ones who want to keep talking indefinitely, because talking means not yet being executed, and I'm a big fan of not yet being executed. It's my whole personality." Something twitched at the corner of her mouth. She smoothed it away before it could become anything, but Lucas saw it, and filed it under the small collection of things keeping him alive. At the dock waited a vessel that made Lucas's own ship look like an apology. It was less a ship than a piece of drifting architecture. A vast silver structure of tiered decks and hanging gardens and slow-turning rings, its hull chased with patterns that shifted as the light moved over them, the whole of it wreathed in a soft luminescence that seemed to come from the thing itself, rather than any lamp. The Drifting Court. Even Lucas, who knew embarrassingly little about the politics of this stretch of sky, had heard of it. the migratory seat of a people who had given up planets generations ago and chosen instead to live forever in transit, following some ancient route between the stars that no outsider had ever been trusted to learn. "That's your house," Lucas said faintly. "You live in a floating cathedral. I sell buttons out of a jar. I am aware." They crossed a bridge of light onto the lowest deck, and the market noise cut off behind them as though a door had shut, replaced by a hush that had weight to it, the particular quiet of a place where everything is old and knows it. Pip had, at some point in the chaos, come whirring loyally after him, and now hovered at his shoulder, emitting the low, anxious hum it made when it was calculating escape routes and not liking the numbers. Elena led him through halls that Lucas would spend the rest of his life failing to adequately describe, and at last into a chamber open on one side to the whole burning sweep of the galaxy, where she turned to face him properly for the first time. "Do you know who I am?" "I'm getting the strong sense I should," Lucas admitted. "You've got the whole radiance thing, the guards, the palace that flies. I'm working backward from context clues, and none of them are good for me. I am Elena, Azure Queen of the Drifting Court." She said it the way one states a fact of weather, without weight, and that somehow made it heavier. "When I turn in anger in a crowded market, people do not survive it as a rule. My guards were prepared to end you. You should, by every custom of my people, be dead. I really appreciate you not leading with that." And yet. She studied him, and there it was again, that flicker of something behind the sapphire, curiosity and unease braided together. "When I looked at you, I did not want you dead. I have not wanted anything I did not choose to want in a very long time, and I do not understand why an accident of a human in a cheap coat should be the exception." Lucas, who had assumed the smile was a good thing, revised this assessment sharply. "So to be clear, the smile that saved my life is also, from your end, a deeply unsettling malfunction you can't explain." "Yes. And you brought me here to figure out what's wrong with you, and I'm the diagnostic." "That is a crude way to put it, but yes." "I've been called a lot of things," Lucas said. "First time for symptom." She almost smiled again. He watched her decide not to, and turned toward the great window. And for a moment the light drew a silver line down her profile, and Lucas's traitor heart did the locked door thing again, and he decided very firmly to ignore it, because whatever this was, it was clearly a her problem and a him problem, and absolutely not a them problem, and he had exactly enough disasters already. "There is a difficulty you have wandered into," Elena said quietly, "that has nothing to do with you, and now, unfortunately, has everything to do with you." She was silent a moment. "My court is not as still as it appears. There are those within it who would see me married, bound by treaty, to a house that would rule through me and call it partnership. They have been arranging it for a season. A queen who cannot be moved is an obstacle. A queen who smiles unbidden at a human stranger in a public market is a queen who can be moved." Lucas finished, the pieces clicking into a shape he did not enjoy. "Oh no, I'm evidence. I'm a scandal with legs." "You are," Elena agreed. "The most inconvenient thing to happen to me in years." She turned back, and the look she gave him was almost apologetic, which on a queen was terrifying. "And I cannot let you leave until I understand why." Pip, at his shoulder, emitted a small despairing beep. "For what it's worth," Lucas offered, "this is still going better than my last 3 business meetings." They gave Lucas a room, which was generous, and a guard outside the door, which clarified the terms. The room alone was larger than his entire ship and considerably less likely to catch fire. It had a bed you could hold a small conference on, a window full of stars, and a basin that filled itself with warm water when he approached, then made a soft chiming sound of apparent delight, as though bathing him were the nicest thing that had happened to it all week. "I don't trust anything that's happy to see me," Lucas told Pip. "Nothing that likes me this much is free." You're a prisoner in a floating palace with a self-cleaning bath, Pip said. I've reviewed your previous accommodations. This is the first one without visible mold. Perhaps lower your standards of suspicion to match your standards of hygiene. He was still deciding whether to be insulted when the door opened without knocking, because queens do not knock, and Elena stood there in something less ceremonial than before. Simpler. The silver traded for a deep blue that made the whole room feel underwater. Come, she said. If I am to understand you, I must observe you, and I refuse to do it in a room that flatters you. So began the strangest week of Lucas's life, and he had once spent a week hiding in a cargo hold with a preacher and a smuggled ox. She showed him the court, not the throne halls and audience chambers a visiting dignitary would see, but the living heart of the thing, the hanging gardens where fruit grew that tasted of memories you hadn't had yet, the great slow rings where the vessel drew its power from the tides of passing stars, the archive decks where 10,000 years of a wandering people were kept in light. Elena walked him through all of it with the flat, careful narration of a woman conducting an experiment, watching for the reaction that would explain her. The trouble was that Lucas kept reacting wrong, or rather, kept reacting like a person, which turned out to be the thing she couldn't account for. In the gardens, he ate a fruit he'd been explicitly warned not to eat, made a face like a man who has personally offended a piece of produce, and declared it aggressively purple. Elena's court did not describe flavors as aggressive. Elena's court did not, as a rule, describe anything Elena had shown them as anything but an honor. Lucas honored nothing. He asked how the power rings worked and then, upon being told, said, I understood 4 of those words and 2 of them were "the." He looked at 10,000 years of preserved history and asked, with genuine feeling, whether anyone had ever gotten bored and drawn something rude in the archives. No one, Elena said, has ever asked me that. That's a shame. 10,000 years and no graffiti? What were they doing with all that time? Governing, surviving, preserving a civilization across the dark between stars. Sure, but during the boring parts. And she laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it, a short, startled sound, quickly caught, but real. And it changed her face so completely that Lucas forgot for a moment to be a prisoner. She looked away at once, composing herself, but the thing had happened and could not unhappen, and something in the air between them shifted by a degree that both of them noticed and neither named. You should not be able to do that, she said quietly. Make you laugh? I've been told it's my one redeeming feature, that, and I'm surprisingly hard to kill. Both of those, Elena said, may become relevant. What Lucas learned over that week was that the loneliest place in the galaxy was the center of a court that worshipped you. Elena had been queen since she was very young. Everyone she spoke to wanted something, or feared her, or both, and had learned to arrange their faces accordingly. And so she had spent her whole life in rooms full of people, and had not been genuinely surprised by a single one of them in longer than she could remember. She told him this obliquely, in the spaces around other subjects, and Lucas, who understood loneliness, who had left an entire planet because staying meant being no one in particular forever, heard all of it. What about you? She said one evening at the great window, the galaxy turning slowly beyond it. You left your world. Traitors like you always have. What were you running from? Nothing dramatic, Lucas said. That's the embarrassing part. No tragedy, no debt, no vengeance. Just, Earth's a big place, and I was a very small thing in it. And I figured out I could be a small thing anywhere, so it might as well be somewhere with a better view. He shrugged. Turns out being nobody in a spaceship is still being nobody, but you get the sunsets. Elena was quiet for a long moment. You are not nobody, she said. Here. Which was, Lucas thought, possibly the most dangerous sentence anyone had said to him all week, and he was about to deflect it with a joke when the door opened, no knock, and a guard entered with his face arranged very carefully indeed. And Lucas had by now spent enough time in this palace to know that a carefully arranged face meant somebody, somewhere, had decided he was a problem. The wine that evening had a bitterness under it that the servers swore was the vintage. Pip, scanning it before Lucas could drink, went very still and very quiet, and then said, in the small flat voice it used only for genuine emergencies, "Don't. Lucas, do not drink that." And across the room, one of the silver-clad nobles who had been watching Lucas all night with a smile like a drawn blade set down his own untouched cup, and left. Lucas did not drink the wine, which was, in the days that followed, the only thing anyone could agree on. The problem with surviving an assassination attempt in a royal court is that nobody thanks you for it. There is no medal for not being poisoned. There is, instead, a great deal of quiet activity behind closed doors, and Lucas, who had handed the tainted cup to Pip, who had handed its analysis to Elena, who had gone very still and very cold in a way that frightened Lucas more than any raised voice could, found himself, within 2 days, transformed from an inconvenient scandal into something far more useful to his enemies. A suspect. The noble with the drawn-blade smile was named Theodore, and he was, Lucas gathered, the sort of person for whom other people existed primarily as furniture to be rearranged. He was highborn, well-connected, and the driving hand behind the marriage treaty that would have bound Elena to his house. And he had watched a week of the Queen laughing at a human's jokes with the expression of a man watching his investment catch fire. He was also, Lucas had to grudgingly admit, extremely good at this. Because when the accusation came, it was beautiful. It came at a full gathering of the court, in the great hall beneath the turning rings, before every noble house of the drifting court assembled. Theodore rose grave and sorrowful, a man burdened by unwelcome duty, and announced that the sacred tidestone, an ancient relic that the vessel's power rings were somehow keyed to, a thing older than any living memory and roughly as important to these people as their own history, had been stolen from its shrine, and that the thief tragically, unbelievably, was the human stranger the Queen had taken so recently and so inexplicably into her confidence. The evidence was produced. It was, Lucas thought with a kind of horrified admiration, genuinely excellent evidence. There was footage of a figure in his cheap coat entering the shrine. There were his access patterns, logged in the court systems, threading exactly the route a thief would need. There was, found in his own quarters, a fragment of the shrine seal, planted, obviously. But a fragment is a fragment, and it doesn't care whether you believe in it. He was poisoned, Theodore said smoothly, when Lucas protested the wine. We all heard the rumor. And is it not convenient? A man cries assassination to make himself a victim, the better to hide what he truly is. We opened our home to him. We let him walk our archives, our gardens, our shrines, and he repaid us by laying hands on the one thing that keeps this court alive. He turned to the assembled houses, and his voice dropped into something soft and devastating. The question before us is not only the human. The question is the judgment of a queen who let him in. And there it was. The whole trap, laid bare in a single sentence. And Lucas understood at last exactly the shape of the thing he was standing in. Theodore didn't need Lucas to be guilty. He needed Elena to choose. Condemn the human, the man she had laughed with, the first person in years who had surprised her. And she was proven a fool who had nearly handed a thief the keys, unfit to rule alone, in need of a steadying hand and a steadying marriage. Defend him, stake her word, her crown, her judgment on a nobody in a cheap coat. And she proved herself compromised, ruled by feeling, exactly the queen Theodore had spent a season painting her to be. Either way, the throne bent toward his house. It was, as traps went, airtight. Lucas caught Elena's eye across the hall. She was seated above them all, still as carved stone, and he could see her running the same calculation he had just finished, and arriving at the same dead end. He gave her a small, helpless shrug, the shrug of a man who has read the room and finds it entirely against him, and mouthed, very slightly, "Don't." She understood. He watched her understand. He watched her weigh her crown against him with the terrible fluency of someone who had spent her whole life weighing things, and he willed her, with everything he had, to make the safe choice, the queen's choice, to cut him loose and keep her throne, because he was one man and she was a civilization, and the math on that was not hard. Elena stood. "The human," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the silent hall, "did not take the tide stone." A murmur ran through the houses like wind through grass. "I know this," she went on, "because I know him. Because in a week I have learned more of his character than I have learned of some of yours in a lifetime of your careful faces." Her gaze found Theodore, and it was not a queen's gaze anymore. It was something older and colder. "And because a man who cries out at poison and then hands the cup to be examined, rather than quietly disposing of it, is not a man engaged in a deception. He is a man telling the truth and unlucky enough to be believed by no one. Sentiment," Theodore said gently, "is not evidence, your radiance. You have just told this hall that your judgment of the human rests on a week's affection. I could not have made my own case better myself." He inclined his head, and the trap closed, and everyone in the room heard it. "I call for the right of standing. Let the houses decide whether a queen so moved by a stranger is still fit to stand alone, or whether the court requires that she stand beside a house that can steady her." The murmur became a roar. Above it all, Elena stood very straight, and Lucas, accused, framed, and utterly out of clever things to say, realized she had just spent her throne to keep him breathing, and that neither of them, yet, had the faintest idea how to get it back. The right of standing would be held in 3 days. When the court reached the star, it had been drifting toward for a season. Some vast old sun the vessel would slingshot around to renew its rings, a migration point of enormous ceremonial weight, which Theodore had chosen with the care of a man who understood that grand backdrops make guilty verdicts feel like destiny. 3 days. Lucas, confined again to his room but not yet in a cell. Elena had spent some of her dwindling authority on that much, spread the problem out in his head like inventory and found it wanting. "Let's review," he said to Pip, pacing. "We can't prove I didn't take the stone because the evidence is perfect. We can't find the stone because Theodore has it somewhere we'll never look. And we can't accuse him because he's a noble house and I'm a scandal with legs. That's 3 walls. Where's the door?" "There is no door," Pip said. "I have modeled it. In 61% of outcomes you are exiled. In 34% you are executed. In 5% the ship malfunctions and we all die together, which I have flagged as the least bad option because at least it's fair." "Pip, I'm being supportive." Lucas stopped pacing. Something had been snagging at the back of his mind since the Great Hall. Some small, wrong note in Theodore's beautiful case, and he chased it now the way he'd once chased a bad ledger, and caught it. "The footage," he said slowly. "The footage of me in the shrine, my coat, my walk. It's good. It's really good. But it's me, every gesture. And I've been on this ship a week. Theodore's had a season to plan this, but he's only had a week to study me." He turned to Pip. "You know what it takes to fake a person that well? To get someone's walk, their little habits, exactly right?" "An extraordinary quantity of reference footage," Pip said, and then, catching up, went bright with the particular joy it reserved for other people's mistakes. Oh, he had to record you, constantly, for days, to build the forgery. Which means somewhere in the court's own systems. There is a surveillance trail," Pip finished, "that predates the theft. He was watching you before the crime he's accusing you of. You can't build a forged you out of nothing. The forgery is the confession." It was a thread. It was a small, fraying thread, and pulling it would require getting into the court's archive systems, which Lucas could no more do than fly the ship with his teeth, but he did not have to do it alone. And this, it turned out, was the thing Theodore had failed to account for. Because a week of being a person instead of a symbol had earned Lucas something a scandal in a cheap coat was not supposed to have: friends. There was the guard captain, a broad, weathered woman who had stood outside his door and, over 3 days of Lucas talking through it because he talked when frightened, had come to the private and dangerous conclusion that a man who narrated his own anxieties to a closed door was not a criminal mastermind. There was a keeper of the archive decks who had never forgiven the court for its lack of graffiti, and had found, in Lucas, the first person to take her 10,000 years of tedium seriously. And there was Pip, who could not fly the ship with its teeth, but could, given a way in, tear through a record system like a terrier through a hedge. The way in came from Earth junk. Of course it did. Because the court's security was ancient, elegant, and layered against every threat its makers could imagine across 10,000 years of wandering, and its makers had never once imagined a harmonica. When the guard captain walked Lucas to the archive deck under the cover of transferring the prisoner for questioning, and the deck systems demanded an authentication tone none of them could produce, it was Lucas who pulled the battered harmonica from his coat and played the deep, ugly, machine-dying note that had emptied a market stall a week ago. A raw analog frequency, unfiltered, unfamiliar, a sound the security mesh had no category for, and so, briefly, catastrophically mistook for a maintenance override. "That should not have worked," Pip said, diving into the open system. "Nothing I do should work," Lucas said. "And yet here we are." What Pip found was everything. The surveillance trail, days deep, time-stamped before the theft. The forgery's construction, frame by frame, stitched from footage no innocent accusation could explain. And, buried beneath it, the true log of the Tidestone's removal, not by a man in a cheap coat at all, but by Theodore's own people, on Theodore's own order, the relic spirited into a private hold on his house's deck to be recovered at the right, in a final flourish of triumph. They had him. They had all of him. The guard captain looked at the log, and then at Lucas, and her weathered face did something complicated. "This will unmake a noble house," she said quietly. "You understand what you're holding." "I understand it's the truth," Lucas said, "and that a week ago I'd have sold it to the highest bidder and felt clever." He closed his hand around the data. "I've had a bad influence. Her name's Elena. Come on, we've got a right to ruin." The right of standing was held, as promised, in the shadow of the great old sun, the court's rings drinking light until the whole vessel blazed and the assembled houses stood in a hall gone gold at the edges. Theodore had chosen his backdrop for destiny, and destiny, Lucas thought, as he was marched in under guard, was about to be extremely rude to him. It began exactly as Theodore had scripted it. He rose, sorrowful and magnificent, and spoke of duty and of theft and of a queen led astray by sentiment, and he built toward the moment he had planned for a season, the flourish, the recovered relic, the triumph. He had even arranged for the Tidestone to be discovered mid-rite, produced from a search of contested holds, so that he might restore it to its shrine with his own hands before the eyes of every house, and stand revealed as the court's true and steady savior. Lucas had to give him this. As a piece of theater, it was flawless. It had only the single flaw of being a lie, and lies, in Lucas's professional experience, kept terrible inventory. "Before the houses render judgment," Theodore said, spreading his hands, "let the missing relic be sought, that all may see the depth of what this human has." "By all means," said Elena. "Let it be sought." She had not moved from her seat above them, still as stone, and there was something in her stillness now that Lucas recognized, because he'd worn it himself across a card table with a bad hand and a good bluff. "But since we are seeking, let us seek honestly. Keeper." The keeper of the archive stepped forward, and the great hall's golden light dimmed, and into the air above them all, Pip threw everything. The surveillance trail, days deep, time-stamped before the theft. The forgery assembling itself frame by frame in merciless clarity, a false Lucas built stitch by stitch from stolen footage. And then the true log, Theodore's people, Theodore's order, the Tidestone carried not by a stranger in a cheap coat, but into a private hold on Theodore's own deck, where it waited at that very moment to be heroically discovered. It played across the burning air for every house to see. And the silence that followed was the same silence that had once rippled outward across a market from the point where Lucas's shoulder met a queen's hip. And Lucas found he had a real fondness for that silence now. Theodore, to his credit, did not grumble. He drew breath to explain, to reframe, to build one last beautiful thing out of the wreckage, and found that the houses were no longer looking at him with fear or ambition, but with the flat, unforgiving attention people reserve for a man they have just watched try to sell them their own history. There is no speech that survives that look. He knew it. He closed his mouth. "The right of standing," Elena said, rising at last, "asks whether a queen who feels is fit to rule. I will answer it, since a house has spent so much to force the question." She descended toward the floor of the hall, and the gold light moved with her. "For years I stood alone and felt nothing, and you called me strong. A stranger made me laugh, and I called it a malfunction, because I had forgotten that feeling and judgment are not enemies. They are the same faculty, wearing different faces." Her gaze swept the houses, and it was warm, and it was iron. I felt that this man was honest. I was right. My judgment and my heart returned the same verdict, because they were never two things. Any house that mistakes a queen's coldness for her competence may leave my court. Theodore's house may leave first. It was done that cleanly. A noble house does not fall in fire. It falls in paperwork and quiet, in the withdrawal of every hand that had been propping it up. The instant propping it up stopped paying. Theodore was gone from the hall within the hour, and from the court by the next migration, stripped of the treaty, the marriage, and the careful reputation he had spent a lifetime arranging. And Lucas felt about this exactly as much sympathy as a poisoned cup of wine deserved. Afterward, the relic restored, the guard captain promoted, the archive keeper granted, at Lucas's insistence and to the visible bafflement of the entire court, formal permission to draw one rude thing somewhere in the 10,000-year record so that future historians might know their ancestors had a sense of humor. Afterward, Elena found Lucas at the great window, where the old sun was falling behind them and the dark between stars was opening up ahead. "You could have run," she said. "When Pip found the truth, you held proof that could unmake a house. You could have sold it, or fled with it, or bargained your freedom and vanished. A week ago you told me that is what you would have done." "A week ago I was nobody in a spaceship," Lucas said. "You told me I wasn't nobody here. Turns out that's a hard thing to walk away from once you've heard it." He looked at her. "I spent my whole life being small enough to slip through any room without touching a soul. I was very good at it. And then I bumped into exactly one person by accident, and it's the first thing I've done in years that felt like it counted." Elena was quiet a moment. "Do you know what the smile meant?" she said. "In the market. I told you I did not understand it. I understand it now." She turned to face him fully. "I had spent so long among people who arranged their faces that I had forgotten what an honest one looked like. And then a clumsy human turned around in a panic and had no idea who I was, and wanted nothing from me, and could not hide a single thing he felt. And I smiled because, for the first time in years, I was looking at someone real." Her mouth curved, slow and unguarded, the same smile that had once emptied nothing and saved everything. The queen who never smiled for anyone. It was never that no one deserved it. It was that no one ever surprised me. You did. "For the record," Lucas said, and his heart was doing the locked door thing again, except the door was open now and he'd stopped pretending otherwise. "I'm going to keep doing that. Surprising you. It's my one redeeming feature." "You have several," Elena said, "but we can discuss the others in transit. Stay, not as a scandal or a symptom or a prisoner, as the man I choose, openly, as a queen, and not as anyone's captive." She offered her hand, blue against the burning dark. "Bump into me on purpose this time." And Lucas, who had left an entire world to be no one in particular forever, and had found, at the far edge of a floating market, the one collision worth stopping for, took her hand. Behind them, Pip emitted a small, satisfied beep and noted, to no one, that the odds had finally come out in their favor. And out past the window, the court drifted on between the stars, following its ancient route into the dark, carrying two people who had, against every custom and calculation, simply chosen each other. Think about the last time you moved through a crowded room, careful not to touch anyone, proud of how invisible you'd learned to be. We get so good at that, slipping past, keeping small, never letting our shoulder brush another life. We call it politeness. Sometimes it's just fear wearing better clothes. Lucas spent years perfecting the art of never colliding with anyone. And then one accident, one clumsy half-second he'd have given anything to take back, turned out to be the truest thing he ever did. Not because the universe rewarded him, but because for once he stopped hiding what he felt, and someone finally saw a real face in a room full of arranged ones. That was the secret behind the Queen's smile. Not magic, not prophecy, just the ache of being surrounded by people and recognized by none of them, until someone honest bumped into her by mistake. So here's what lingers, long after the court drifts on into the dark. How much of yourself have you learned to hide just to move through the crowd unbruised? How many faces have you arranged, waiting for one person real enough to make you forget the performance? And when you finally do collide with something that matters, will you apologize and slip away, small and safe as ever? Or will you turn around and stay? Because the collisions we brace against are so often the ones that save us. The interruption you didn't want. The stranger you weren't looking for. The moment that ruins your careful plans and hands you a whole life instead. We are all, every one of us, one accidental shoulder away from being seen. The only question the story leaves you with is the one it can't answer for you. When it happens, and it will you be brave enough not to look away? The end. Elena and Lucas's story is over, friends. Before we go, I have a request. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to hit the like button and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Our next science fiction story will be released very soon, so don't forget to subscribe to Sci-Fi Traveler to avoid missing it. See you in the next story.